eyes began to shine with hatred. Upon noticing this, our boy panicked and asked it to calm down. Showing the kunai and holding the gecko in his arms, Soryang explained that he was only trying to help and treat its friend. Our boy's attention was fixed on the kunai and his eyes filled with surprise and confusion. Upon seeing the weapon, the gecko exploded with rage and began to roar. The gecko's body began to release an intense frozen kai, repelling Soryang. Our boy panicked, realizing that it was pissed off. The gecko jumped, and upon noticing this, Huiyin stood in front of our boy and with a worried gaze asked him to be careful. Without hesitating for a second, she pushed Soryang. At that moment, the fierce gecko descended forcefully to the ground. But luckily, Huiyin and Soryang were barely saved. Soryang hugged the injured gecko tightly and fell backwards onto the ground. The attention of the other gecko fixed on them and it started roaring again. The gecko's eyes began to shine with rage. Soryang extended his hand toward it and with an expression full of fear asked it to wait a moment. With a serious gaze, Soryang admitted that this was not what it seemed, asking the creature to calm down. Just then, Soryang's eyes widened in confusion. The female gecko that Soryang was holding in his arms began to make sounds, leaving our boy somewhat confused. With eyes shining with fury, the gecko prepared to attack. But then, it calmed down and felt somewhat surprised. The two geckos began to talk to each other and couldn't help but laugh. Soryang's attention was fixed on them, making his jaw drop. At that moment, Peng Muin and his men returned to the cave and with a worried gaze, the leader asked if Soryang was okay. Gripping his sword tightly, Peng Muin admitted that the gecko was vicious and fast. He didn't expect it to slip between his legs. Upon seeing Peng Muin's sword, the gecko clenched its teeth and began to roar. Just before things could heat up, Soryang stepped in the middle, raised his hand and with a serious expression asked Peng Muin to wait a second. With a confident smile, he told Peng Muin that he was fine and asked him to step back a little since he was going to try talking to him for a moment. Peng Muin's eyes filled with confusion as he didn't know if Soryang wanted to try talking to the gecko. He asked if our boy thought the gecko could understand words. Looking at the gecko, with a confident expression he said that the gecko seemed to understand speech up to a certain point and it was likely that it wouldn't attack them again. He asked if Huiyin could bring some dry grass. With a confused gaze, she nodded her head. With a cheerful smile, she and the centipede began to collect the dry grass that was near the rocks. A while later, she prepared a soft nest of dry grass for the female gecko. Soryang and Huiyin sat next to the female gecko, and our boy asked the male gecko not to worry since he was not trying to hurt her, explaining that he had removed the shell that would not come off and had taken away what was covering her eyes, asking him to make sure to keep licking her eyes for a while. The gecko approached her and with a curious gaze began to lick her eyes. Soryang crossed his arms and revealed that only one problem remained. Upon hearing this, the attention of both the gecko and Huiyin focused on Soryang. Touching his head, Soryang began to observe her tail and revealed that her eyes should heal well. But the problem was her tail. Half of it was already rotting and he didn't believe that licking it would help. The gecko began to look at her tail and couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. He turned towards Soryang and nodded with his head, saying that he was right. Forming scissors with his fingers, Soryang revealed that they would have to cut the tail. The gecko's face filled with sweat and fear when he imagined Soryang cutting her tail. The creature began to roar again. Upon seeing this, our boy felt somewhat confused. The gecko jumped and with glowing eyes prepared to attack. Soryang put his arms in front of his chest and with a gaze full of fear, began to scream. A few hours later, Peng Muin's men lit a campfire inside the cave, while Soryang and Huiyin were sitting on the rocks. Using her finger, Huiyin began to apply a special balm on Soryang's cheek. Our boy let out a sigh and felt furious, since he was only trying to help but even so the gecko had bitten him. Huiyin, who was applying the balm on his wound, asked him to stay still, explaining that if he moved it could leave a scar. Peng Muin, who had his arms crossed, began to laugh, saying that Soryang was finally starting to act like a real man since after all, he had gotten a glorious scar in battle. Upon hearing this, Huiyin began to stare at Peng Muin with a sinister gaze. Feeling her gaze, the patriarch could not help but feel fear. Touching his cheek, Soryang felt relieved since the misunderstanding had somehow been cleared up. The small centipedes climbed onto Huiyin's body and began to play. Seeing how the centipedes were not reacting to any murderous intent, he realized that little gecko never intended to harm him in the first place. While they were distracted, Gupi appeared and called their attention. Upon hearing his voice, Soryang's and Huiyin's attention turned to Gupi. Gupi appeared alongside the gecko, revealing that the creature had something to say. With a forced smile, Soryang began to touch his cheek and asked if he was ready. The gecko nodded. Soryang stood up, promising to do his best effort. But before that, he wanted to ask something to the gecko. He began to observe our boy and became somewhat curious. Showing a finger, Soryang asked what geckos ate, since if he was going to cut her tail off, she was going to need to eat something nutritious in order to recover well. Taking small jumps, the gecko turned his back on them and began to move away. Soryang panicked and started to follow him. The little gecko moved several meters away and stopped near a small plant. Soryang's eyes filled with curiosity and his attention focused on the plant. Using his mouth, the gecko pulled out the plant and began to show it to Soryang. Our boy took the small plant in his hand. Pangmuin and Huiyan began to observe it closely. With a curious gaze, she asked if she could take a quick look at the plant. Our boy did not refuse and handed her the plant. Huiyan took the plant and began to inspect it carefully. Showing the plant to Soryang, she revealed that although it was weak, she could feel a bit of kai seeping out. She was sure that this was a seed of a spirit herb that used to grow in this cavern. Soryang's eyes widened in confusion. He took the seed and his jaw dropped in surprise. With a serious gaze, Pangmuin revealed that he had heard about it long ago. It was said that spirit herbs always grew where spiritual beasts dwelled. The centipedes were sleeping on top of the rocks. Huiyan began to observe them and explained that if that was the case, then maybe these little ones, just like the centipedes, survive by feeding on the kai of the spirit herbs. Soryang clenched his fist and his jaw dropped, realizing that if they unearthed the spirit herb, then that meant they were in serious trouble. He panicked and started to replant the herb again, but Pangmuin mentioned that it was no longer useful. Soryang planted the herb again, but Pangmuin placed his hand on his shoulder and revealed that once a spirit herb had been touched by human hands, it would not grow again. He was sure that the gecko knew this and for that reason had unearthed it to show them. Even if he replanted it, it was not going to grow beyond this point, leaving our boy in shock. Soryang began to imagine Jughu pulling out the spirit herbs that were in the cave, and the little geckos crying. Soryang's eyes filled with tears knowing that humans were very cruel. With a curious gaze, Pangmuin asked Gupi what the name of the spirit herb that used to grow here was. Gupi began to observe him in silence, and revealed that that thing was called frost ginseng. Pangmuin began to ponder, and then a smile appeared on his face since then all they had to do was find something that emitted the same type of kai as the frost ginseng. Upon hearing this, our boy stood up and his eyes began to shine with joy. He asked if there really was something like that. With a smile, Pangmuin nodded his head and then revealed that it was called ice jade, just like the frost ginseng. It contained the essence of cold kai. Touching his chin, he mentioned that the problem was how to obtain the ice jade, since even with money, it was not something that could be obtained easily. While they were distracted, Huiyan stepped forward, capturing their attention. With a serious gaze, she said that if they were talking about the ice jade, then she knew someone who had it. Upon hearing this, a curious smile appeared on the faces of Soryang and Pangmuin since for them this was good news. With a curious gaze, Soryang approached her and asked who had the ice jade. She panicked and asked him to calm down. She began to sweat not knowing what to say. Seeing this, Soryang and Pangmuin became somewhat confused. Huiyan swallowed saliva, then began to touch her chin and with a sincere gaze revealed that they were some other weed. Upon hearing this, our boy's jaw dropped in surprise, while on the other hand, Pangmuin became even more confused. With a serious gaze, she let out a sigh. Soryang's eyes widened in fear as he did not know what was happening. Pangmuin and Soryang began to observe Huiyan, not knowing what she had in mind. Even Pangmuin felt confused. Huiyan began to show a confident smile, and upon seeing this, Soryang's eyes filled with fear, and he couldn't help but sweat. He put his hand on his face and let out a sigh. He didn't know why his father-in-law had to say something like that at that moment. He remembered that in this world girls were called weed. Pangmuin crossed his arms and asked who was that other weed who supposedly had the ice jade. Soryang came out of his thoughts and his jaw dropped in surprise, leaving him in shock. Huiyan began to show a confident gaze. Showing a finger she revealed that one of the 3 flowers of Muram was known as the Flame Queen Peony. Her real name was Namgung Seol, the daughter of the Namgung clan. From what she had heard, Seol had the ice jade, but she really didn't need it. Upon hearing this good news, a smile appeared on Pangmuin's face, while on the other hand, Soryang's jaw dropped in surprise. While they were conversing, the little gecko appeared and started making chirping sounds to get Soryang's attention. Upon hearing the gecko's voice, our boy became curious and turned around. The little gecko's eyes filled with tears and sadness. Huiyan asked what he was saying, and Soryang revealed that he was asking them to quickly treat the injured gecko. Soryang reached out his hand and decided to save the rest of the conversation until after treating the gecko. Huion nodded her head. Noticing that the little gecko was nervous, she thought that was for the best. Soryong peeked his head between the rocks and saw the little gecko sleeping. He took her out of the nest and began to examine her carefully. The other gecko's eyes began to shine with concern. With a confused look, Huion remembered that geckos could cut off their own tails. She didn't know why it had held on until things had gotten so bad. With a sad expression, Soryong admitted that she was right, but also revealed that there were some geckos that weren't like that. Upon hearing this, Huion's eyes widened in confusion. When a lizard cut off its own tail, it was called autotomy, and depending on the species, the traits were different. Soryong began to observe the gecko carefully, remembering that there were some who could perform autotomy but couldn't regenerate. Some could both shed and regrow, and others couldn't do either of those things, so he couldn't assume anything and had to examine it properly. Soryong started to touch the gecko's tail. Once they confirmed it, they would find the detachment segment and press it with a finger to trigger the separation. Huion's eyes filled with confusion since she didn't know what that was. With a smile, our boy explained that although it seemed like the gecko's tail could be cut anywhere, in reality, the point where it breaks was predetermined. That was what they called the detachment segment. Huion was in shock since she didn't know much about geckos. Because they weren't poisonous, she didn't know how Soryong knew so much. According to her, this was amazing. The gecko was sleeping in Soryong's hands. He had sounded confident when he said it, but the tail was already very decayed, so he wasn't sure that the surgery would go well. Soryong grabbed its tail and his eyes began to shine with determination. He had to try anyway since he was spicy Fabry. A few minutes later, Soryong and Huion began performing the surgery. Pengmuan, who was sitting on a rock, realized that this was taking longer than he had thought. With a serious gaze, he started staring at Soryong, and the little gecko began to emit chirps. A few minutes later, with the gecko sleeping in his arms, Soryong appeared. Lord Pengmuan asked what had happened to the gecko. Huion began to show a smile, while on the other side, with a joyful gaze, Soryong revealed that fortunately the surgery had gone well. As long as they took good care of her, she should be fine. Upon hearing this, the little gecko couldn't help but cry and show a grateful smile. Our boy sat next to the gecko and felt happy to see that he was so happy. Pengmuan's gaze fixed on our boy. The more he looked at him, the more incredible he seemed. The pair of geckos returned to the nest. Now that the surgery had been completed, Soryong and the others decided to stay nearby and monitor its condition for a few days. A few days later, with a curious smile, Soryong and Huion returned to the cavern and began to run toward the rocks. Near the nest was the pair of geckos playing happily. Seeing that her condition was better, Soryong couldn't help but smile. The little geckos began to show tender looks. Soryong clenched his fists and couldn't help but feel excited, realizing that they had gone from being kittens to being lizard puppies, knowing that if this had happened in his past life, it surely would have gone viral. Soryong's attention was fixed on the female gecko, realizing that the injured girl had also regained some strength. Now that her condition was better, Soryong decided it was time to leave. Upon hearing this, the gecko's eyes widened with sadness. With a smile, Soryong explained that they were not going away forever. They were just going to get some food for them and then come back. Until then, he asked the gecko to make sure to preserve the seeds Kai. The two geckos nodded their heads. Soryong turned around and with a confident gaze told Huion that it was time to return to the Tang clan. With an excited gaze, he clenched his fist and thought that it was time to obtain the ice jade. A few hours later, they returned to the manor of the Tang clan and sat down to chat with the patriarch. Back in the Tang clan, leaving behind the geckos, a few pieces of news had arrived, and among them, without a doubt, the biggest incident had been the matter related to the blood cult. The patriarch interlaced his hands and with a serious gaze decided to speak about that matter. After the identity of a spy infiltrated in the Murim alliance was revealed, their warriors followed the owl that an assistant had raised. A man with a mustache hid behind a tree, and when he peeked out, his eyes widened in surprise and fear. The owl arrived at the hideout of the blood cult, which was filled with ninjas. Coincidentally, a squad had just returned to the Murim alliance, and they had sent them poison extracted from tiger-striped water snakes, which had played an important role when they raided the hideout. Showing a letter, the patriarch revealed that the leader of the alliance had personally sent a handwritten letter of gratitude. He was very proud of Soryong. With a forced smile, Soryong coughed. The patriarch asked if he had caught that mysterious gecko. He decided to stop by the toxic creature garden himself to see how it looked. Soryong began to sweat and with a nervous gaze mentioned that one could say they had half caught the gecko. Upon hearing this, the patriarch felt somewhat confused. Just then, with a serious expression, Huion decided to explain everything that had happened so far to her father. The patriarch put the cup of tea on the table. He began to stroke his beard and started thinking about the ice jade. Resting her hands on the table, Huiyin stood up and explained that for that reason, they had planned to go together to Anhui province to visit the Namgun clan. After thinking, with a calm gaze, the patriarch gave them permission to go. For him this was very convenient since he needed them to deliver something along the way. The timing wasn't the best because of the blood cult, but if Soryang was with her, he could be at ease. Soryang let out a sigh and his eyes filled with confusion since he didn't know if that had been a stealthy way of assigning him a task. Just before they could leave, with a serious expression, the patriarch asked them to wait a moment. He closed his eyes and revealed that some disturbing rumors had been circulating lately about the Namgun clan. Soryang and Huiyin began to look at each other and their eyes widened in surprise. It was nighttime and near the Namgun clan was Yellow Mountain. Two men were walking around the area. The bald man's eyes filled with surprise and he couldn't help but sweat when he asked if his friend was joking. With a confident gaze, his friend said that he was telling the truth. He again mentioned that the young lady from the Namgun clan was not normal. With an angry gaze, the bald man asked his friend to stop saying nonsense and not to make up dirty and scandalous rumors. His friend's attention was fixed on something. Not far from them there was a man lying on the ground. Upon seeing this, their eyes widened in fear. They began to run toward the man without knowing why someone had collapsed here. The friend placed his hand under the man's head without knowing if he was dead. Just then, the man began to smile. Their attention was fixed on the man and they could not help but feel even more confused. The man had not collapsed. Blood was coming out of his nose. He was red like a tomato and gasping heavily, as if he were in love. The men began to look at each other and felt even more confused. They carried the man on their back and decided to take him to the village thinking that he must be drunk. Not far from them, there was a woman hidden behind a tree, watching everything. The woman's body began to release a strange aura. Her shadow became larger. She was like a spider hanging from its web. It was night and under the light of the moon, a woman was practicing with the sword. She concentrated and her eyes began to shine with determination. With precision and elegance, she swung the sword several times, cutting the leaves of the trees. At that moment, her body began to tremble, and the woman began to gasp heavily and felt frustrated. She had not managed to cut all the leaves, so she thought that she still needed more training. A woman with pigtails who was holding a lamp appeared and addressed the woman as Unnai. She was Namgun Yun from the Namgun clan. With a serious expression she suggested returning now since if they arrived late, they were going to be caught. Yun knew that her father was going to scold her if they were caught this time. She admitted that the sword handling was great, but as the eldest daughter of their family, Unnai had to take better care of herself. Unnai began to observe Yun in silence. Using her hand, she took off her hat and with a sincere gaze admitted that Yun was right. She was the eldest daughter of the Namgun clan, also known as the Flame Queen Peony or Soul. At that moment, she began to cough strongly. Seeing this, Yun's eyes filled with concern since she did not know if Seul was okay. Unnai clenched her fist and her face turned pale, since she suffered from the disease called overflowing Kai deviation. At first everyone in the family considered it a blessing. That was because the Kai channels were completely open, which made the construction of internal energy much faster, and there was no blockage at all in the circulation of pure Kai. The old man who was treating her mentioned that too many of her blood points were open, and her innate Kai was being depleted too quickly. With a worried expression, the father asked if there was no solution. The old man put his hand on his chin and began to ponder. With his face sweating, and with a sincere expression, the old man revealed that she needed yin energy, pure and strong yin energy, which should be used before her innate Kai or her life could be shortened. Back to the present, Unnai began to pant heavily and little by little began to run out of energy. Yun approached her and with a worried gaze asked if she was okay. With a smile, Unnai asked her not to worry and suggested going back. With a confused gaze, Yun asked if she was sure. Just then, Unnai's attention was fixed on the lamp. She felt identified and thought that she was like the oil flame inside this lamp. She began to stare at the lamp knowing that she was a being who would disappear once the oil was consumed. She began to look towards the sky knowing that she had to hurry and master at least the Emperor's sword style as soon as possible. Her attention was fixed on the moon and while the wind was blowing, she thought that she should master the style before her body burned and disappeared. It was daytime and somewhere on the Yangtze River there was a boat. On the boat were Soryang, Huiyin and Gupi. Gupi began to point towards the water and asked Soryang to look since the Beiji dolphin had appeared. Upon hearing this, Soryang's eyes widened in surprise realizing that it was the Yangtze River dolphin. The dolphin emerged from the water and began to play. Soryang was in shock since he could not believe that he was seeing with his own eyes a species that had gone extinct. And even though he liked insects and reptiles, dolphins were something different. With a smile, Huiyan mentioned that if they followed the Yangtze River, they would reach Wuhan, where the Muram Alliance was located. Soryang's attention focused on her. With a smile, he explained that according to his father-in-law's orders, they had to stop in Wuhan and deliver the red-necked keelback's poison. After that, they could get off the boat at Angyang, which was considered a safe zone. Huiyan began to show a smile and said that at this speed they could arrive at a much earlier hour. Soryang sat next to her and with a worried expression revealed that there was something he was concerned about. Huiyan sat next to him and with a curious gaze asked what it was. Our boy knew that if the ice jade was really so precious, then the Namgun clan would not hand it over easily. He extended his hand and explained that this fact kept bothering him, no matter how he thought about it. She started laughing and asked him to trust her. She started imagining Hanai and revealed that the ice jade was of special use for the young lady Namgung Seol. She needed to be able to eat it. But the ice jade could not be eaten. She started to point at our boy, being sure that now that they had that, they were going to trade it for the ice jade, since after all, that could be eaten. Soryang put his hand into his clothes. Then he started to touch his chest and mentioned that she was not entirely wrong about that. He felt worried since he did not know if this ice jade was safe. He also remembered that lizards were cold-blooded, so normally they hated everything that was cold. He did not feel good feeding them something he was not sure about. With a serious gaze, he called Huiyan's attention and remembered that she had said that the ice jade contained cold yin energy. He asked what that was, since he had heard about yin and yang energy before, but for him it was still difficult to understand. Huiyan turned towards him and while her eyes were shining with joy, she started to show one finger and began to smile. Because it was important for martial arts cultivation, she decided to explain, but asked our boy to listen carefully and remember. The yin kai was the kai that created the yin fire, and among the kiss of heaven and earth, it referred to the kai that sank downwards and gathered. With a serious expression she revealed that normally, yin energy suppressed the activity of living beings. Dark, cold and fearful things were all types of yin energies, so the expression cold yin energy was simply a type of yin energy. Soryang's eyes widened in surprise and he thought that yin energy was bad. With a smile, Huiyan said no, since in contrast to yin energy, yang energy created yang fire. But an excess of it accelerated living activities, causing faster aging and depleting energy. Soryang began to imagine lizards playing with ice, realizing that the reason those two children needed cold energy was that their bodies were cold energy in itself, and thus they grew by absorbing that yin energy. He thought it was something like recharging batteries. Soryang started touching his head and questioned if yin and yang were not supposed to be balanced, like male and female. He did not know how they achieved that balance when they had pure yi energy. Soryang started touching his head in confusion. Huiyan's gaze fixed on him and she could not help but blush like a tomato. With a nervous expression, she looked away and said that she did not know. She started shouting, saying that they were going to discover how to find that balance between yin and yang later. Upon hearing this, our boy could not help but blush and his mind filled with confusion. She put her hands on her face and felt embarrassed. Just then, Gupi appeared and announced that they had arrived, asking them to get ready to disembark. Their ship docked at the port of Wuhan. Once the ship stopped, Soryang and Huiyan got off. She introduced herself and revealed that they had brought the object he had requested. The man with a ponytail extended his hand and with a smile said that the general was already waiting for them. They started walking across a bridge and Soryang felt amazed. He was in shock to see how grand the Muram Alliance was. Not far from the area, a woman grabbed a man by the ear, making the man start to scream. With his face full of sweat, the man asked the woman named Sword Phoenix to stop since he was about to teach that guy a lesson. With an angry gaze, she made it clear that he could not be dueling against his own allies. With a sincere expression, the other man told Seonghu that she was right since he had acted too hastily without verifying the facts first. Seonghu said that he was only defending the honor of the young lady. At that moment, something caught Seonghu's attention. His gaze fixed on Huiyan and he soon realized that she was the poisonous flower. Huiyan turned around and recognized the man with a white bandana as Slaying Dragon, the woman as Sword Phoenix and Seonghu as Spear Dragon. With a smile, she remembered that it was the first time they met since the Dragon Phoenix meeting. She asked how everyone had been. Seonghu could not help but smile since it had been a long time since he had last seen Huiyan. They began to talk among themselves, and Soryang remembered that in Muram, only those with remarkable skills received titles like Dragon or Phoenix, realizing that all of them were elite martial artists. Sword Phoenix said that she had something to ask her, revealing that there was a strange rumor circulating about her. Upon hearing this, Huiyan felt somewhat confused. She revealed that there was a rumor circulating that she had a lover. Huiyan's eyes widened in surprise. Our boy started sweating and felt confused. With a confused expression, she asked if it was true that this rumor was circulating about her. With a nervous smile, Seonghu said yes, revealing that all the warriors were gossiping about it. He was about to challenge him to a duel in her honor for spreading nonsense. They were comrades who fought together, so he wanted to defend her honor. Our boy noticed that he had a crush on her. Huiyan looked to the side and made it clear that this rumor was false. Seonghu felt furious and decided to find the warrior who was spreading the false rumor and give him a good beating. Huiyan stepped forward and decided to correct that rumor. She grabbed Soryang by the arm, leaving him somewhat confused. She began to show off Soryang and with a proud smile revealed that she did not have a lover, but rather a fiancé. She introduced Soryang as her fiancé. Upon seeing this, everyone went into shock. With a surprised expression, Sword Phoenix noticed that Soryang was very young. With a forced smile, Huiyan apologized and thought that she should have introduced Soryang to them earlier. Soryang and the others greeted each other. Just when he raised his head, he saw Seonghu staring at him with a murderous gaze. He approached our boy and asked if his name was Soryang. With a face full of fear, Soryang said yes. Seonghu knelt before our boy, leaving everyone in shock. He introduced himself as Yang Seonghu, the spear dragon of the Yang family of Sichuan. Our boy started sweating like crazy. With an angry expression, Seonghu challenged Soryang to a duel. Seonghu asked Soryang to accept the duel, leaving them in shock. Sword Phoenix and Slaying Dragon let out a sigh and felt somewhat disappointed upon seeing Seonghu's attitude. With his face full of sweat, Soryang asked if he really wanted to challenge him to a duel. With eyes shining with rage, Seonghu said that he wanted to have a duel man-to-man. Just then, Sword Phoenix grabbed Seonghu by the collar and pulled him, leaving him somewhat confused. With an angry gaze, Huiyan asked what Seonghu was doing, suddenly asking for a duel. With eyes shining with rage, Sword Phoenix began staring at Seonghu and asked him to take things seriously. Soryang's eyes began to shine with confusion. He couldn't believe that Seonghu wanted to have a duel with him as soon as they had met. He didn't know why he kept meeting strange people. At that moment, someone wearing white clothing approached them and asked why they were making such a fuss. This man was none other than the military advisor, Junju. Soryang closed his eyes and greeted the military advisor with respect. Upon seeing this, Seonghu's eyes filled with fear, and he couldn't help but panic. Junju hit Seonghu in the face with the fan and with a furious gaze demanded to know what he was doing to the guests. Upon receiving the blow, poor Seonghu panicked. With a kind smile, Junju suggested going together to the Heavenly Martial Pavilion where the leader of the alliance was. Soryang's eyes widened in surprise and he nodded his head. Junju, Soryang, and Huiyan went to the Martial Pavilion. Seonghu clenched his fist and his eyes began to shine with rage since he wanted to have a duel with Soryang. Seeing his expression, his friends felt somewhat confused and suggested that it was better to leave. It was daytime and next to the Heavenly Martial Pavilion there was a beautiful river. Huiyan decided to wait in the guest hall. Soryang, who was walking beside Junju, did not refuse and nodded his head. A girl who was in the guest hall began to sweat and with a nervous expression started pointing out the way, saying that first they had to go greet the leader of the alliance. Soryang's attention focused on her and he soon realized that she was a rookie and seemed a little lost. Junju began to smile and mentioned that they had caught that guy thanks to Soryang and explained that she was the one they had brought to replace the previous maid, who had turned out to be a spy, and because she was new, she was still somewhat inexperienced. Our boy began to show a forced smile. The maid closed her eyes and informed the leader that the general and the young warrior from the Tang clan had arrived. Upon hearing this, the leader gave them permission to enter. The door of the hall opened. The leader of the alliance was standing on the balcony enjoying the views. Junju and Soryang bumped their fists against their palms and bowed their heads to him as a sign of respect. Our boy introduced himself as Soryang from the Tang clan of Sichuan. Upon hearing this, the leader's eyes filled with surprise. With a kind smile, he asked them to come in since he knew that Soryang must be tired from such a long journey. Just then, something caught his attention, putting him on alert. He began pointing at our boy with his finger and with a serious expression questioned whether those little guys on his wrist and waist didn't bite just anyone. With a surprised expression, our boy said that they didn't bite just anyone. The little centipedes were sleeping under Soryang's clothes. He remembered that it was said the leader was one of the top 3 martial masters in all of Muram. He couldn't believe that he had instantly noticed the poisonous creatures wrapped around his body. They sat down to chat, and the leader got straight to the point and asked if Soryang had brought the venom from the tiger-striped water snakes. Soryang said that he had, and with a smile revealed that he had prepared as much as possible just before leaving. He had brought 3 bottles. Junju was in shock, and with a calm expression mentioned that when he was in Sichuan, he had seen the process of extracting that venom. A complicated task. It required a lot of work and effort to collect. He didn't know how to thank Soryang for having brought 3 bottles. The leader began to look at our boy and mentioned that he had heard that he had become the son-in-law of the Tang clan. Soryang turned his head toward him and nodded. The leader decided to ask about his parents, and Soryang revealed that he had no family. He was alone in this world and had no one to trust. Junju interrupted the conversation and with a serious tone said that he had heard that Soryang had lost all his memory in an accident, and before being taken in by the patriarch of the Tang clan, he used to live alone on Hainan Island, hunting snakes and selling them. The leader crossed his arms and it didn't take long for him to realize that Soryang must have lived a lonely and difficult life on his own. With a cheerful smile, Soryang began to touch his head and mentioned that he wasn't completely alone. The leader decided to change the subject and talk about the reason why he had summoned Soryang. He knew that our boy had played an important role in the recent blood cult incident and wanted to grant him a reward. The eyes of our boy widened in surprise. With a nervous gaze, he mentioned that he had already told the general what he needed the last time. Junju began to show a smile. What Soryang had discovered was something enormous, enough to ensure that those disgusting leeches from the blood cult would never set foot on the Central Plains again. And according to him, this kind of service deserved more than just a simple reward. With a nervous expression, Soryang began to shake his hands in denial, revealing that it had been something he had stumbled upon while trying to save his people from them. If it was that gift which had already been promised to him, according to him that was more than enough for him. The eyes of the leader and of Junju began to shine with seriousness. The leader placed his hand on the table and asked if he had really stumbled upon it while trying to save his people. He stood up, crossed his arms, and couldn't help but smile, as he had been wondering why he felt a sense of closeness with Soryang. Now he had realized that it was because they were alike. Soryang's eyes filled with confusion, and the leader clarified that he wasn't talking about their faces. With a serious gaze, he revealed that he had lost both his clan and the one he loved because of those bastards from the blood cult. He was struggling, doing everything possible to save even a single remaining member of the family, and at some point along the way, he reached enlightenment and achieved martial mastery. The leader began to observe our boy and mentioned that he had heard that Soryang had thrown himself against an elder of the blood cult while he was poisoned in order to save his people from the Tang clan. With a smile, our boy said it was true. A smile appeared on the leader's face since he had done the same thing 30 years ago. He began to walk towards Soryang. Despite being imposing, he had thrown himself in completely, with nothing but desperation in his heart. He placed his hand on our boy's shoulder, leaving him somewhat confused. With a smile, as a reward, he decided to grant our boy his unique martial art, called Iron Coffer Technique. The jaws of Soryang and Junju dropped in surprise. The leader couldn't help but smile and with a confident gaze revealed that he had never taken a disciple before, and when he died his martial art would disappear with him. He had no intention of pretending to be his master, so he decided to let the Tang clan know they didn't need to worry. Junju stood up and his face was covered in sweat. Our boy was open-mouthed and sweating like crazy. From the bottom of his heart, he thanked the leader and swore to make sure not to bring shame to his great name. Upon hearing this, a kind smile spread across the leader's face. Once night fell, Soryang was walking around the area carrying a heavy book. He held the book tightly. The alliance leader was granting him his own martial art. For now, Soryang had to keep it secret from everyone except for the elders of his clan, since if it were found out, he could become a target of the blood cult. He decided to return to the guest hall and thought that if he told Huyen she would be delighted. Just then, a man appeared and began watching him in silence. The man asked our boy to wait. With a curious gaze, Soryang turned around and saw the furious Xianghu staring at him. Soryang couldn't help but tremble. Xianghu took a step forward and with a serious look said that he had heard that Soryang had passed through the heavenly martial pavilion. He had come since he still hadn't received an answer regarding their duel. Our boy was in shock to see how persistent this guy was. With a sincere expression, Xianghu admitted that he wanted to know if Soryang was a man worthy of marrying Huyen. He wanted Soryang to prove it. With a nervous gaze, Soryang said that a duel was very dangerous. Pointing at the spear with his finger, Xianghu explained that he shouldn't worry about that, since he was going to remove the tips from his spear. With a piercing gaze, Soryang revealed that he was worried because he was afraid that Xianghu could end up dead. Both remained silent for several minutes, looking at each other. Soryang's words made Xianghu angry. He grabbed Soryang by the collar and with a furious gaze demanded to know what he had just said. Just then, something that was hidden in our boy's clothes started to move. Xianghu's attention fixed on it, leaving him somewhat confused. With a furious gaze, the small centipedes emerged from Soryang's clothes and lunged at Xianghu. At that moment, our boy caught the centipedes and asked them not to bite Xianghu. The arrogant Xianghu fell on his butt to the ground, his face filled with sweat and fear since he didn't know what was happening. Soryang approached him and with a smile mentioned that as he had told him it was dangerous. Soryang sat in front of Xianghu, making him start to sweat like crazy. With shining eyes, with an arrogant expression, Soryang made it clear that he had already forgiven him once. Xianghu began to pant heavily with fear and realized that Soryang was not joking. If our boy had not stopped the centipedes, he really would have died. Soryang stood up and began to show a penetrating gaze. Xianghu realized that he was a fearsome man. In Yan Xianghu's eyes, Soryang was like a monster. Our boy asked if he was okay, and at that moment, Hayan appeared and with a confused gaze asked what they were doing. Upon hearing her voice, Soryang's eyes widened in surprise, making him panic. With eyes shining with rage and a murderous intent, she questioned whether Xianghu was planning to harm Soryang. Resting his hand on Xianghu's shoulder, with a forced smile, Soryang explained that there had been a misunderstanding. He had gotten lost after leaving the pavilion, and at that moment Xianghu had appeared and offered to show him the way, so for this reason, they were together. Huiyan began to ponder in silence. She did not know whether to believe that Xianghu had offered to show Soryang the way. Upon observing closely, she saw that the centipedes were restless. With a nervous gaze, Soryang placed one of the small centipedes on Xianghu's head and mentioned that after chatting he wanted to show the centipedes to Xianghu. So he had asked Xianghu to release a bit of killing intent and this was what had happened. Our boy explained that he was only joking with Xianghu. Xianghu was confused, but decided to play along with Soryang. He stood up and placing his hand on his shoulder, with a smile mentioned that Soryang was right. Huiyan's eyes filled with suspicion. She didn't know if they were telling the truth. She thanked Xianghu for guiding Soryang and decided it was time to return to the reception hall. With a nervous smile, Soryang nodded and started running. Xianghu put his hand on top of his head and let out a sigh of relief since he had narrowly avoided getting into trouble. While Soryang was walking away, he turned around and with a smile made it clear that he had saved Xianghu's life twice. After saying this, they left. Xianghu's jaw dropped in confusion. He didn't know what was happening. The next morning, the ships began to arrive at the port. Soryang, Huiyan and Gupi got ready to leave. With a smile, she greeted Xianghu and the others by bowing her head and explained that they had something to do, so they had to go, thanking everyone for their kindness. Slaying Dragon asked both of them to take care. Just before they could leave, with a curious gaze, Sword Phoenix asked Soryang to wait a moment. Then, she placed her hand on Xianghu's shoulder, with eyes full of nervousness. He bowed his head to Soryang as a sign of respect. Sword Phoenix mentioned that she had heard what Xianghu had done and thanked Soryang for his generosity. Soryang's eyes widened in confusion. Xianghu started touching his head and with a nervous gaze thanked our boy, explaining that after talking with Sword Phoenix at night, he had realized how foolish he had been. A proud smile appeared on the faces of his friends. With eyes full of tears, he clenched his fists and revealed that he had convinced himself when he saw Soryang's great tolerance, who had covered up his bad manners. According to him, Soryang was the most suitable as Huiyan's fiancé. He asked our boy to take good care of her in the future. Soryang said goodbye to them and couldn't help but smile. He had heard that they would meet again at the Phoenix Dragon Conference, so there was no need to become enemies. Once Soryang and the others boarded the ship, Xianghu and the others bid them farewell with a smile. They departed in the sky filled with birds. Late at night, in the village below Mount Huang there was an inn. Soryang and the others stayed at the inn and sat down to eat. A maid brought them food and left. They had left Wuhan and arrived in Anqing. Gupi suggested that it was better to rest in this place since it was late. Mount Huang could be rough, and it took half a day to reach the Namgung clan. Soryang began to eat calmly. They decided to spend the night at this inn after hearing Gupi's words. Huiyan's eyes filled with confusion, leaving her in shock. She couldn't believe that Soryang had received the secret manual of the iron coffer technique. the exclusive martial art of the Fist Emperor. Soryong mentioned that he had said they looked alike and asked if that was a good thing. She nodded because although it was said that training for the Iron Coffer technique was painful, once he mastered it, it could even block swords and Kai-based attacks. With a cheerful gaze, she revealed that it was the exclusive martial art of the very Emperor of the Fist himself. Some even said that it rivaled Shailin's indestructible diamond divine art, and since it was an external martial art, it was not heavily influenced by internal cultivation methods, so Soryong wasn't going to have any problem learning it. Soryong was in shock as he knew that if he mastered the technique, he would gain bulletproof defense. He knew that he had inherited an incredible technique. With a kind smile, she offered to help him train, as she had heard that the first emperor used to whip his own body every morning as part of the regimen and she could do this for Soryong. Soryong's jaw dropped upon hearing that the first emperor used to whip his own body, clenching her fists. She said this was true since hardening skin through whipping was part of training. Soryong couldn't help blushing at the thought of Huiyin dressed as a maid holding a whip. Just then, an old man approached them and asked if they were planning to climb Mount Huangshan. Soryong's eyes filled with curiosity and he turned around. Huiyin nodded her head and questioned why the old man was asking this. The old man introduced himself as the owner of the inn and asked if they were heading to the Namgung clan. Our boy stood up and with a confused gaze asked if there was any problem. Huiyin remembered that her father had said that sinister rumors had been spreading. She didn't know if this could be related to them. The old man approached her and revealed that during the last few months, the people who had gone up Mount Huangshan had started to disappear. Eventually they had been found safe and sound, but all their yang energy had been completely drained. Upon hearing this, Soryong's face filled with fear, while on the other hand, Huiyin became suspicious since according to her this was strange. She questioned what all of this had to do with the Namgung clan. The old man coughed and couldn't help blushing when he revealed that each of the people who had come back to their senses had said the same thing. The person they had spent the night with was none other than Lady Namgung Xiao of the Namgung clan. Upon knowing this, Huiyin's eyes widened in confusion, leaving her in shock. She began arguing with the old man saying that this was absurd. According to her this must be a trap, a malicious slander. Soryong asked her to calm down. The old man panicked and with a nervous expression revealed that everyone had reacted like her. It was night and the moon was high in the sky and not far away was the manor of the Namgung clan. Xiao was sitting in her room sewing. Just then, a maid opened the door to her room, making her curious. The maid informed that the patriarch had summoned her to the patriarch's hall immediately, leaving her somewhat surprised. Without wasting any more time, she left her room and began heading toward the patriarch's hall. She did not know if her father had found out that she had been secretly training fencing at night. Once she arrived at the patriarch's hall, her eyes filled with surprise. In front of the patriarch there were several men kneeling. When he saw that she had arrived, the father's eyes began to shine with seriousness. He gave the order to all the men to raise their heads, and asked everyone to say if the one they had seen was really his daughter. With a face full of fear and trembling, one of the men raised his head, and the others began to ask for mercy. With a furious gaze, the father gave them the order to speak the truth at once, leaving Xiao somewhat confused. With a serious expression, he asked if Xiao had been secretly going out to Mount Huangshan at night. He revealed that these men were saying that she had drained their yang energy. Her eyes widened in fear and confusion. Her face filled with fear and she couldn't help but cry. The father began to point at her and asked her to speak clearly. With a sincere gaze, she admitted that it was true that she had been training with her sword in the valleys of Mount Huangshan the last few days, but swore that aside from training with the sword, she hadn't done anything else. The father turned toward the men and said that his daughter had declared herself innocent, so they must provide solid evidence of what they claimed to have seen. With eyes full of tears, the fat man swore that they only spoke of what they had seen with their own eyes. They did not intend to insult the young lady. The other man began to cry since he didn't know what was happening in this world, nor if everyone had gone crazy or been possessed by spirits. Upon hearing this, the fat man's eyes filled with surprise. He stood up and said that there was a mole. The patriarch became curious and asked which mole he was talking about. Pointing at his chest, he revealed that the woman they had seen had a mole on her chest. With a curious expression, the father thought this was nonsense, turned around and asked Xiao if it was true. She put her hand over her mouth and her eyes began to shine with fear, leaving her in shock. Seeing her expression, the father couldn't help but get angry. He couldn't believe that this was true. Huiyin and Soryong left the inn and began to walk through the forest. Huiyin's face was full of rage. Our boy approached her and with a curious expression asked if she was still upset about what the innkeeper had said. Despite being so, she denied it. In front of them was Gupi, who carried all the luggage in his backpack. With a furious gaze, Huiyin turned around and made it clear that it was ridiculous to think that Namgung Xiao was absorbing men's masculine energy every night. Soryong's eyes widened in fear, realizing that she was upset. Huiyin let out a sigh. With a sincere expression, she apologized since she didn't want to get angry. But according to her, those rumors were nonsense. She revealed that Namgung Xiao could not have contact with men, leaving Soryong in shock. With a face full of sadness, Huiyin revealed that Xiao had a strange illness, and if she didn't constantly receive yin energy, her life expectancy would shorten. Due to that type of body, yang energy was like poison for her. That's why she was careful not to let any man get close to her. So spending each night with men was something impossible for her. With a confused gaze, Soryong realized that this scenario was like that of a fantasy heroine. He didn't know if this was going to end well. Several hours later, they arrived at the entrance of the Namgung Manor. With a serious gaze, the guard began looking at Soryong and asked what they had come for. Huiyin began whispering, and her eyes started shining with seriousness, realizing that the family atmosphere in the Namgung clan wasn't good. So it was possible that the guards wouldn't allow them, and if they said they came to see Xiao without any reason. So she asked our boy to make something up. With a curious expression, Soryong decided to listen to her. Our boy approached the guards, coughed, and with his eyes shining with confidence said they had come to make a deal. The guards said nothing, and upon seeing this, Huiyin panicked since she didn't know what Soryong was saying. Seeing that the plan hadn't worked, our boy couldn't help but sweat. Just then, someone opened the door upon hearing the commotion. Upon seeing who this person was, Soryong and Huiyin's eyes filled with surprise, leaving them in shock. This person was Namgung Yoon. She was just as surprised to see Huiyin. Thanks to her, Soryong and the others entered the clan's manor, and Huiyin and Yoon began to dance with joy. Yoon was happy since it had been a long time since the last time she had seen Huiyin. With a smile, Huiyin mentioned that it had been 2 years since the meeting of the 7 families. With a confused expression, Yoon asked what Soryong meant by making a deal. Huiyin closed her eyes and let out a sigh. With a nervous expression, Soryong began to show a smile. Huiyin explained that they needed the ice jade, and she had heard last time that Xiao had it. Upon hearing this, Yoon felt somewhat surprised. With a sincere gaze, Huiyin mentioned that they really needed it, so they had come to see if they could get it. Yoon put her hands together and with a kind smile suggested first going to the patriarch's hall to talk about the matter with her father. She was sure that her father was going to be happy to see Huiyin after such a long time. Resting her hands on Soryong's shoulders, with a smile, Huiyin revealed that she had brought something to exchange for the ice jade. Our boy's eyes widened in confusion. Yoon was in shock and asked if she wanted to exchange Soryong. Not long after, they went to the Namgung clan patriarch's hall. They told everything to the patriarch. He stood up and with a surprised gaze asked if it was true. His eyes widened in fear. He was in shock since he couldn't believe that they had brought an elixir that contained cold energy. Huiyin asked Soryong to show it. Upon hearing this, with a smile, our boy put his hand inside his clothes, took out the elixir, and placed it on the table. The patriarch's attention was fixed on it and his mind was filled with surprise. Inside the elixir there was something shining. With a curious gaze, the patriarch asked if he could take a closer look, and with a smile Soryong gave him permission. Soryong couldn't help but sweat. It was an elixir that he had brought very carefully, keeping it in his arms. He hoped that they would accept this exchange. The patriarch began to examine the elixir carefully, and mentioned that the purity of cold kai was very high. With this, she could endure at least 10 years. With a curious expression, Yoon asked if really it was so incredible. Because it was so valuable, the patriarch decided to exchange it for the ice jade. Upon hearing this, a joyful smile appeared on the faces of Huiyin and Soryong. Pointing at it with his finger, the patriarch noticed that there was something inside and questioned what it was. With a forced smile, our boy said he couldn't tell him that. The patriarch realized that it could reveal the place where the elixir had been found and decided not to ask further. With a smile, Soryong coughed and thanked him. But then his face filled with fear since he knew that wasn't the real reason behind it. A few days ago, Soryong was in the clan walking with the grandfather. Our boy began to feel something cold in his clothes. The old man's attention fixed on him and he asked if there was any problem. Our boy took it out of his clothes and his eyes widened in confusion. It was a tail. Soryong handed the tail to the grandfather and mentioned that there was a strange thing similar to an ice crystal in the gecko's tail that he had kept as a souvenir. With a curious expression, the grandfather began to examine the tail carefully, and noticed that it had cold kai, knowing that it was going to be good material for those who had mastered ice martial arts or cold kai martial arts. Soryong began to touch his chin and remembered the small geckos. He thought they stored nutrients in their tails, like fate-tailed gecko. He would have never thought that it was actually cold kai. With a smile, the grandfather asked if Soryong wanted to try turning the tail into an elixir. Back in the present, our boy was in shock since he knew that a withered gecko's tail wasn't even worth mentioning. With a cheerful gaze, the patriarch asked Yoon to go tell her sister to exchange this elixir for the ice jade. Upon hearing this, she nodded. Now that they were already here, he asked them to rest a little. He had to organize a party to welcome the guests of his clan. He also noticed that Huyen was close to Seol. He revealed that his daughter had gone through something difficult recently, and wondered if she could comfort her while she was here. With a smile, Huyen did not refuse. They stood up and Yoon decided to guide them to the guest residence. They left the mansion and began walking. With a smile, Yoon mentioned that thanks to Huyen, her father was in a good mood these past few days. They had been walking on thin ice. With a curious gaze, Huyen asked what had happened to Seol since she had heard rumors near Mount Huangshan. Yoon's eyes filled with surprise upon noticing that she knew that. Her eyes began to shine with sadness because she didn't think Seol would do something like that. But since they hadn't been able to find any clues, she was locked in the confinement room and had to be marked with virginity sand to prove her innocence. Huyen was in shock and Soryong was somewhat confused. Virginity sand was something women applied on their bodies to demonstrate that their body was pure. If you raise a gecko in a jar and feed it cinnabar, its body will turn red. Huyen revealed that afterwards it was ground into powder and applied to the woman's body. If her body was pure, that blood mark could not be washed off even with water. Upon hearing this, Soryong's eyes widened in surprise and confusion. He was furious since identifying a maiden was the task of a unicorn, not that of a gecko. Seeing Soryong's expression, Huyen panicked. Just then, they arrived at the place where Seol was, catching their attention. Soryong's eyes widened in surprise. Not far from them sat Seol with the blood mark still on her hand. With a smile, Huyen greeted her. Upon seeing Huyen, Seol couldn't help but go into shock. Yoon revealed that she had brought an elixir containing cold kai. Their father wanted her to exchange it for the ice jade. Yoon gave Seol the elixir. Her eyes widened with curiosity and her jaw dropped upon noticing the immense cold kai of it. She thanked them and decided to make the exchange, making Huyen and Soryong feel happy. She took out the ice jade and handed it to Soryong. Our boy began to observe it carefully and couldn't help but smile. Just then, with a sad gaze, Seol let out a sigh. The attention of our boy and Huyen focused on her. With a sincere gaze, Huyen admitted having heard the rumors. She didn't believe that Seol would do something like that, so she asked her not to get too discouraged. With an expression full of sadness, she mentioned that there were many witnesses who knew where her mole was. Soryong's eyes filled with emotion upon realizing that this was a mysterious case. He put his hand over his face and couldn't help but smile. Our boy was an expert in this kind of thing, and in his previous life he was called Sherlock Faber when they played escape and deduction rooms. With a smile, he asked if Seol had ever bathed alone in a pond or river at night. She began to observe our boy and felt confused. With a serene expression, Huyen asked if he wanted to know if someone had been spying on her. Soryong's jaw dropped when he realized she was right. With her face full of sweat, Seol admitted never having bathed outside, and even if they had seen her, they had no reason to defame her. The people who were in the reception hall were like family since they lived together in the village at the foot of the mountain. Yoon mocked Soryong, saying that he was wrong. Soryong's face filled with sweat. He couldn't believe that he had failed. He fell to his knees on the ground and begged for forgiveness. Just then, Huyen noticed something. Putting her hands together and with a smile, she revealed that she had solved the mystery. According to her, there was only one probable explanation for this situation. Everyone's attention turned to her and all felt confused and curious. With a serious gaze, she revealed the probable explanation for this situation. With a serene expression, Huyen decided to reveal the identity of the possible culprit. Everyone began to look at her with a curious expression. Huyen remained silent until several seconds later, with eyes shining with confidence, she revealed that the culprit was a ghost. The faces of Yoon and Seol were filled with sweat and their eyes widened in surprise, leaving them in shock. Huyen nodded her head. Soryong's eyes filled with confusion since he was thinking that she was going to say something profound. He didn't know why she suddenly started talking about ghosts. With a curious expression, Soryong began to touch his chin and started thinking about it. He remembered encountering the ghost of the blue-spotted centipede after it died, so this situation wasn't so absurd. Soryong extended his hand and asked Seol if by any chance she had touched or done something strange lately, like eating the inner core of a spiritual beast. Seol began to ponder and with a serious gaze revealed that she had recently touched an acorn and also a tree branch. Soryong and Huiyin began to sweat and felt confused, realizing that this was what they called idiotic charm. Seol's eyes widened in surprise. She clasped her hands and remembered something. She revealed that while she was training alone at night, she felt the presence of someone. It was as if someone had been watching her all the time. With a confused expression, Yoon asked her sister if this was true. Seol nodded her head. She had no doubt about it. She had clearly felt it. At first she thought it was Yoon, and when she went to check there was no one. She put her hand on her chin and couldn't help but wonder if she was being too sensitive. Soryong began to observe her, knowing that this was a suspicious situation. While they were distracted, a maid came running. Upon hearing her voice, the sister's attention focused on her. With a face full of sweat and while panting heavily, the maid revealed that something terrible had happened. Upon hearing this, with a worried expression, Seol asked what was going on. The maid clenched her fists and revealed that another villager had disappeared. She also mentioned that the warriors had left the clan's territory to begin the search. With a confused gaze, Yoon asked if this was true. Seol began to look down at the ground and couldn't help but feel furious. Soryong's attention fixed on her. With a calm expression he asked if she was okay. Seol's eyes began to shine with determination. No matter what, she had to catch the ghost personally and avenge the affront against her lost chastity. Yoon clenched her fists and with a serious gaze asked her sister not to go, since if she sneaked out alone again and was caught, this time it was going to be a very serious problem. Seol started to think, and then with a smile, asked Yoon not to worry. Then she turned towards Soryong and Huiyin, and revealed that this time they were not going alone. With a confused gaze, Yoon asked what she meant by that. Seol approached Huiyin and grabbed her hand, and with a sad expression asked if the two of them were willing to help her. Soryong and Huiyin's eyes widened in surprise, leaving them in shock. Night fell and somewhere in the forest there was a small owl sitting on a branch. When it turned around it saw Soryong and the others searching the area. With her body trembling and her eyes full of tears, Yoon grabbed Huiyin by the arm knowing that if she was caught this time, they were going to lock her up in the closed cultivation room. Then she thought she would be trapped there for at least half a year. Upon hearing this, Huiyin began to show a nervous smile. Yoon turned around and mentioned that Soryong must be helping her stop Seol. She didn't know how Soryong could fall in love with her so suddenly. Soryong's eyes widened in confusion, and he began to show a nervous smile. A moment before, Seol took out a golden ornament. She explained that it was a norigi made of knots. The central piece was designed so that an ice jade could be inserted. Our boy and Huiyin remained listening in silence. With a serene gaze, Seol mentioned that although she wasn't very sure why they needed the ice jade, if they were looking for something to carry with them, this wasn't a bad option. Soryong and Huiyin began to observe it closely, and their eyes widened in astonishment. She split it in half, revealing that even it could be split in half, it could serve as a symbol between the two. She promised to give it to Soryong if he helped her. Our boy went into shock. Their attention was fixed on the bright ornament. Back in the present, our boy began to think silently. He placed his hand over his chest and made it clear that, as he had already said before, it wasn't because he wanted the norigi. He simply wanted to protect Lady Seol's honor. Yoon's face filled with rage. She knew that Soryong was lying. Seol began to stare at her sister and asked her not to be so impulsive. While Huiyin was showing a forced smile, Yoon began to lose her mind since she didn't know what she should do. Several minutes later, they stopped walking. This was the area where she had felt someone's presence. There could be some kind of trace, so she decided to thoroughly check the area. Huiyin approached her and with a worried expression asked what they were going to do if the culprit really was a ghost. Seol began to show her sword and promised to cut the ghost with her sword imbued with the energy of destroying evil and revealing justice. Soryong began to observe carefully, realizing that this was intense. Just then, his eyes widened with curiosity and surprise as something caught his attention. Out of nowhere, fog began to appear in the area. Now none of them could see. Soryong began to look from side to side and became confused, not knowing what was happening. He began to shout and call for Seol and the others. He began to walk around the area without knowing if they had been separated. Just then Soryong's foot bumped into something. He became confused, not knowing what was happening. When he looked closely, he realized it was a spiderweb. He grabbed it in his hand and noticed that the thread was very thick, realizing that the creature that had created the web was enormous. At that moment, screams began to be heard. With a gaze full of fear, our boy turned around. He panicked since the voice was Yoon's. He didn't know what had happened to her. Our boy called the little centipedes, Grace and Myra, and asked them if they could find their mother. The little creatures began to smile. They jumped from Soryong's clothes and began to run. Soryong entrusted them with the mission of going and protecting Hwaein. Our boy began to run through the forest, realizing that they were being dragged deeper and deeper into the forest. He didn't know why there were spider webs. He began to pant heavily, remembering that spiders were divided into two types, sedentary and wandering. The sedentary ones built a web and stayed in one place, while the wandering ones roamed like vagabonds. The forest was full of spider webs. He knew that no way, none of them wove flat webs on the ground, which meant this was not an ordinary spider. Red fog was all over the forest, and once the fog began to clear, with a serious expression, Soryong decided to hurry and find Yoon and the others. Several seconds later, our boy stopped walking. The trees in front of him were full of cobwebs. He began to observe this and his eyes widened in confusion since he didn't know what was happening. At that moment he heard Yoon's voice, and when he lifted his head his eyes widened in fear. She was wrapped in spiderwebs and stuck to a tree. Upon seeing this, our boy panicked. With a surprised gaze, Soryong turned around and saw a woman sitting on top of a giant spider. The woman began to smile. It was Seol, with her eyes shining with evil. She started staring intently at Soryong. With eyes shining with evil, Seol began to show a smile. Soryong's face filled with fear. He was in shock since he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. The area was covered in webs. It was a type of ground spider that our boy had never seen before. It wove its thread on the ground, not the air, so he thought it was a new species. Soryong clenched his teeth and began to stare at Seol, who was sitting on top of the giant spider. He finally understood everything that had happened. What was in front of him, under the form of Namgung Seol, was a pedipalp disguised as the spider. A pedipalp was, in essence, a sensory or manipulation appendage of spiders, often mistaken for a leg but actually being a specialized organ attached to the head, used for touch, mating or prey capture. He observed how, with a slight slide, it was revealing its shoulders and acting seductively to attract him, and thought that this must be the result of evolution to attract male prey. Soryong began to blush and thought there was no need for that, since he had already been captivated. Yoon regained consciousness and tried to free herself from the silk that was wrapped around her body. Her attention was fixed on Soryong. She was furious to see that even he had fallen into the trap. Without hesitating for a second, our boy began to walk toward her. Seeing this, a smile appeared on the spider's face. With his face full of love, Soryong mentioned that she was very beautiful. Without wasting another second, he hugged the spider, leaving her in shock. Her eyes began to shine with evil, and with a smile, she prepared to attack Soryong. At that moment, our boy gave the order to one of the centipedes to bite. In the blink of an eye, the small centipede emerged from Soryong's clothes and bit the spider on the neck. She opened her mouth and began to scream in agony. Soryong moved away. The little centipede jumped and returned with our boy. With eyes full of tears, the spider reached out to Soryong and tried to ask for help. Her expression was too realistic, and for our boy it was not surprising that people fell into her trap. She put her hand on her neck and began to feel dizzy. Not long after, she collapsed to the ground. Soryong began to pant heavily and his eyes widened in confusion. He did not know if the poison had paralyzed her. Using a stick, Soryong began to touch the body of the spider. The venom of a centipede was a neurotoxin intended to paralyze other insects. He thought that although centipede-type insects had quite strong venom, the size of this creature should correspond to its toxicity, so it would be fine. He began to pet the spider and asked it not to be upset since he had saved it from being captured and killed by the villagers. Soryong's eyes began to shine with excitement, and without hesitating for a second, he began to hug the spider. He was happy because the spider had a bright red body, 4 large spots on its back, soft and dense fur like velvet. He began to pet it again. According to him, it was like a scarlet spider. With a curious expression, he decided to see how pretty the spider's face was. He wanted to know what shape it had, and thought that it maybe had big fangs like those of a tarantula. Soryong lifted her skirt, and at that moment, Hwaein appeared and with a furious expression gave him a powerful kick in the face. Our boy's eyes filled with confusion, leaving him in shock. Soryong's body flew off and crashed against a tree. With eyes shining with seriousness, Hwaein made it clear that the spider was a monster. She asked him to try to breathe while circulating his internal energy, asking him to do it slowly. She put her hand over her face and her eyes filled with fear, realizing that she had not controlled her own strength when attacking. Soryong began to gaze toward the sky. He seemed to have lost consciousness. Several minutes later, he stood up. With a worried gaze, Huan asked if he was okay. Our boy became somewhat confused. With eyes full of fear, she revealed that the mist surrounding the forest was clearly the work of the spider. Inhaling the mist made men's desires increase so much that it was like an aphrodisiac. She inhaled a little and was very surprised, so she forced the mist out of her body with her internal energy, and then came to where Soryong was. With a serene expression, Soryong revealed that he had not felt anything strange. He put his hand on his chin and came to the conclusion that the villagers acting as if they had been possessed was the work of the mist. He did not know if it was some kind of pheromone that spiders released. He started to touch the spider and asked Huang what this monster was. It could release mist and was gigantic and poisonous. Huang couldn't help but feel afraid when she saw that Soryong was touching the spider. She began to look at the ground and apologize to Soryong. She put her hands over her face and started blushing like a tomato. She had thought that Soryong had been seduced by the spider. Soryong was confused, but she was right. In a different sense, he really had been seduced. Soryong began to pet the spider's leg, explaining that he was only trying to observe the shape of the spider. According to him, the leg was very fluffy and cute. With her face full of sweat, she asked Soryong to stop petting the spider. She couldn't help but blush and, with a surprised look, began to remember something. A bright red body, 4 large spots on its back, and soft dense fur like velvet. Soryong's eyes widened in confusion. He didn't know why she was so nervous. Just then, someone coughed, making both of them turn curiously. With a confused gaze, Soryong turned around, and not seeing anyone, he couldn't help but wonder if the spider had made that sound. The voice started to sound again, making Soryong's eyes widen in surprise. It was Yoon, who still had her body wrapped in silk. Our boy panicked since he had completely forgotten about her. She began to cry, and upon seeing this, Soryong quickly lowered her, and they placed her body on the ground. Huan and Soryong sat next to her. Yoon's face was pale and she was gasping heavily. She was breathing, so he realized that she was only paralyzed. Upon hearing this, Huan felt relieved. It was night, and Soryong mentioned that now all that remained was to find Seol. Now that the mist had disappeared, Huan was sure of being able to find her soon. Our boy stood up and decided to do one thing before going to look for Seol. Huan's attention fixed on him and she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused. He started to tie the spider's body using the threads of its silk. Several seconds later, our boy completely tied the spider's body. He started to drag the spider's body and decided to take it back to the clan to check what kind of monster it was. He was sure that it was not a creature. Huan did not refuse. Not long after, Seol began to make her way through the forest and move toward them. Upon noticing this, Huan's eyes filled with surprise. Seol's eyes began to shine with worry upon seeing that Yoon was lying on the ground and gasping heavily. Her eyes filled with tears and rage. The spider had not only dared to stain her honor, but had also dared to hurt her little sister. She began to draw her sword and prepared to kill the spider. Seeing this, Soryong panicked and asked her to wait. Without hesitating for a second, Soryong started running and stood in front of the spider. Seeing this, Seol stopped. She began pointing at the spider with her sword and with a serious gaze asked our boy to get out of the way. With an expression full of determination, Soryong stood firm in his decision and refused to step aside. Upon seeing this, Seol felt confused. Soryong began to point at himself with his finger and made it clear that he had been the one who had caught the creature, so now it was his. Huan's eyes widened in surprise, leaving her in shock. Seol began to gaze toward the ground in silence, not knowing what to do. She let out a sigh, and while her eyes were shining with rage, she began to stare intently at Soryong and asked what he had just said. With a furious expression, Seol asked what Soryong had just said. Our boy swallowed hard. According to him, killing the small creature was too much. He remembered that first she had killed a salamander with a poisonous chant, and now wanted to kill the spider. Huan grabbed Yoon in her arms and asked Seol to wait, revealing that she was still alive. She was only paralyzed. Upon hearing this, her eyes filled with relief and surprise, and she asked if this was true. Huan confirmed it and asked her to calm down. Huan understood Lady Namgung Seol's feelings, but warned that if the hosts were killed and the mimicry broken, it would change into another form, and then there would be no way to clear Lady Yoon's name ever again. Looking at the spider with a serious expression, she asked Seol to think about it. If she took the spider and showed it to her family members, her grievance would be cleared. Besides that, it had been Soryong who had caught that host. He found the elixir that would be delivered to her and even saved Lady Yoon's life. It was Soryong who helped clear Lady Yoon's grievance, therefore Seol should not wield her sword recklessly. Soryong and Seol's eyes filled with surprise. She let out a sigh and began to think about it. She put away her sword and apologized to Soryong, explaining that she had not considered the kindness he had shown her. With a confused gaze, Soryong began to wave his hands, saying that this was not important. With a smile, he gave Huiyan thumbs up and could not help but praise her for being able to think so logically in a situation like this. Observing the spider carefully, Xiao asked what Soryong planned to do with the creature. Our boy explained that, for now, he planned to forgive it and take it back to the Tang clan. Soryong began to caress Xiao's head and with a face full of emotion mentioned that she was very cute. Upon hearing this, Xiao's eyes filled with surprise and she couldn't help but blush like a tomato. She misunderstood the situation, started touching her fingers and got nervous mentioning that Soryong already had Lady Huiyan. Huiyan let out a sigh and with an exhausted gaze explained to her that Soryong hadn't said it with that intention. He was only referring to the fact that the host spider itself was cute. It was red, its fur was soft and it possessed unique abilities, which is why Soryong had expressed that he found it adorable. Upon hearing this, Xiao's eyes filled with fear. Soryong's attention, who was caressing the spider, focused on her, leaving him somewhat confused. It was night and when he asked what the two of them were talking about, they changed the subject. At dawn, the spider and Lady Namgung Yun were safely transported with the Namgung family. Everyone was in shock since they had never seen such a large spider before. The patriarch panicked and began to draw his sword, furious upon learning that this creature had stolen his daughter's appearance and insulted her. Our boy asked him to calm down, explaining that now the misunderstanding about the lady would be cleared up and the rumors corrected. Upon hearing this, the patriarch decided to calm down, and Soryong realized that he and Xiao were alike. After all, they were father and daughter. The patriarch extended his hand to express his most sincere gratitude to the young warrior. He declared that it was as if he had saved the lives and honor of his two daughters and assured that the Namgung clan would never forget such kindness, so they would honor his wishes. Pointing at the spider with his finger, our boy mentioned with a smile that, just as he had said, he would take that guest with him. The patriarch showed no objection but mentioned that there was one thing that worried him. Upon hearing this, our boy became somewhat curious. The patriarch was in shock to see that the creature was still in the form of his daughter Xiao. He reasoned that, if that creature had stolen his daughter's appearance, it could also change into another form. Therefore, he asked if it could not at least adopt a different appearance. He never wanted to experience such doubts about his own daughter again. Soryong put his hand under his chin and began to ponder. He understood that, although he had secured ownership of the creature, there still remained the matter of image rights, and he wondered what should be done about it. Just then, he turned around and his eyes filled with surprise. Suddenly everything was becoming chaotic. He ran up to Gupi and asked what was happening. Gupi reported that the crowd was very agitated. 3 old men appeared, visibly furious. They began shouting, referring to the creature as a cunning little thing and a bastard who had been imitating the young lady's appearance. They demanded to know what they were doing and why they weren't killing it. With a serious gaze, Gupi extended his hand and asked them to watch their words. He reminded them that this guest had been captured by his clan and asked if they were daring to defame the property of the clan. Upon hearing this, the old men panicked and begged for forgiveness. Soryong crossed his arms. Now that the misunderstanding was already cleared up and it seemed that almost everyone who needed to see it had already done so, he explained to Gupi that they should not accept anyone else, as he was concerned that the creature could be hurt if this continued. Gupi nodded his head and gave the order to the guards to close the entrance. Once the people left, the guards closed the entrance. But just then, someone appeared and asked them to wait. It was a bald old man with a cane, who was gasping heavily and whose eyes were full of fear. He began to cough and asked if he could take a quick look. The guard explained that he had orders from above and couldn't do anything about it. With his face full of sweat, the old man explained that he was just going to take a look for a moment. The guard started touching his head and mentioned that it wasn't allowed. With a smile, our boy asked the guard to show him, since he realized that he had come a long way despite his poor health. The old man's eyes filled with surprise and with a grateful expression, he thanked our boy. The old man approached the spider and began to observe it carefully. Soryong and the others remained silent. The old man's eyes filled with tears, and upon seeing that it was true, the spider's attention focused on him and its eyes widened in surprise. The old man turned around and asked if Soryong was going to kill the spider as the others said. With a calm expression, Soryong replied that he would by no means do so. He explained that it was a precious creature and he planned to take it to Sichuan to raise it properly in the Tang clan. Although its diet might seem unusual, it was simply a guest. According to him, this was something predetermined by the heavens, and it wasn't the little creature's fault. The old man's eyes filled with tears of joy, since he had never heard anyone say something like that. He decided to trust him. Without wasting any more time, the old man began to untie the ropes that were around the spider. Seeing this, Soryong and the others panicked. With eyes shining with concern, our boy revealed that this was very dangerous. After untying the spider, the old man began to caress it, and the spider's eyes began to shine with joy. With a confused gaze, Soryong let out a sigh. For him it was not surprising, since from the beginning he had felt that a familiar aura emanated from him. He began to observe the old man closely, realizing that he was a kindred spirit. There was no doubt about it, he was an enthusiast. The old man revealed that the name of the spider was Yowa. He explained that one day, after losing his entire family to the plague and falling into despair, he had found the little creature, who at that time was only about as big as his fist, and they started living together. That had been more than 20 years ago. When he still had vitality, he personally fed her with his yonkai in order to raise her. However, as his strength waned and he could no longer provide her with his yonkai, these kinds of things had begun to happen. He turned around and revealed that she had ended up doing something terrible to the young lady of the Namgung clan, and it was all his fault. Soryong's eyes filled with surprise. The old man couldn't help but cry, confessing that he didn't know what to do. He had been wandering in anguish, but now that a gentleman as kind as him had taken her in, he could finally rest easy, so he begged him to please take good care of his Yowa. Soryong greeted the old man with respect, bowed his head before him and promised to raise her well. With tears in his eyes, the old man explained to Yowa that he was already old and could no longer take care of her. He asked her, please, to follow Soryong and live a long life. Yowa and the old man gave each other a hug, and the creature's eyes filled with tears. Soryong felt moved and couldn't help but cry, amazed that a pet could understand human speech and respond to emotions in that way. He wondered how much time they must have spent together, realizing that the old man had truly treated and treasured her like a daughter. He reached out his hand and asked the old man to please stop. He asked if he would consider following them to Sichuan, suggesting that it might be better for them to go together instead of simply parting ways. The old man refused and, with tears in his eyes, explained that he deeply appreciated his words, but he was no longer young enough to endure such a long journey. Besides, his family's graves were here, so it was impossible for him to leave this place. Soryong began to touch his head and, with a smile, asked the old man if he could share the experience he had acquired raising Yowa, explaining that it was the first time he dealt with a creature like that. The old man promised that he would answer anything he asked to the best of his knowledge. Our boy began to blush and, with a nervous expression, admitted that what aroused his curiosity the most was undoubtedly yonkai, and asked how it was provided. The old man extended his finger and Yowa began to suck on it. He decided to show him directly how it was done, explaining that the finger was simply inserted in that way. He added that apparently even just sleeping together was enough to transmit yonkai. The form of the host began to change and everyone's attention was fixed on her. The old man revealed that when yonkai was transmitted in this way, the creature would transform into the form it considered most beautiful in the eyes of its owner. Yowa took the form of a beautiful woman. It was the appearance of the old man's late wife when she was young. He had wanted to see that face before dying and, upon achieving it, he felt relieved. With a curious gaze, the old man asked if Soryong wanted to try. Our boy approached her and began to ponder silently. Our boy inserted his finger into Yowa's mouth, and not long after, her form began to change again, causing Soryong's eyes to widen in surprise. His eyes began to shine with excitement, as he wondered what form it would take, assuming that, naturally, it would be Lady Huiyan's. The spider began to change shape, and upon seeing the form that it had taken, the old man and Soryong went into shock. Goopies and the patriarch's eyes filled with fear and surprise. They asked if that new form was to her liking. The spider began to change shape and took the form of a wooden doll. The old man's eyes widened in confusion and surprise. According to him, this form was, without a doubt, the appearance that Yowa had shown only once before taking human form. Goopy panicked and asked Soryong why she did not appear as Lady Huiyan. Our boy was not very sure. Soryong began to sweat and feel dizzy. He understood that the reason why Yowa, or rather, the creature, had been able to maintain Namgung Xial's appearance all that time was because most of the villagers considered her the most beautiful woman. However, now it was about the most beautiful woman in all of the Central Plains, Tang Huiyan the poisonous flower. He himself had given his Kai Yang to the creature, and yet Yowa had not transformed into Lady Huiyan, which made no sense to him. Soryong turned his back on them and started to run. He was sure that the Tang clan would see this as nothing other than a betrayal against them. Seeing this, Goopy and the others were thrown into confusion. Soryong began to pant heavily. For him, this was inconceivable. He refused to accept that his fascination with poisons was stronger than his admiration for Lady Huan, much less that this was the reason why the creature had revealed its true form. He was convinced that there clearly had to be another explanation for what was happening. At the same time, Huang was in Namgung Yun's room at the guest residence. On the bed lay Yun. Not long after, Soryang opened the door running. Upon noticing this, Huang's eyes filled with confusion and surprise. She didn't know what was happening or why he was so out of breath. Soryang said he had a favor to ask her. With eyes shining with seriousness, he asked if he could hug her. This made her blush like a tomato. With a forced smile, Soryang began to wave his hands and asked her please not to misunderstand him, saying that it wasn't like that. Although later, changing his mind, he considered aloud that maybe a misunderstanding wouldn't be so bad after all. She stood up and clenched her fists and couldn't help but get nervous upon realizing that in the end he had found out. She put her hands over her face and revealed that she had not intended to hide it on purpose. She had only read about it in books, so she was not sure herself, and, consequently, had not been able to say anything. Soryang became confused since he did not know what she was talking about. She began to gasp and decided to talk about that spider, revealing that it was one of the 10 great venomous creatures of the Central Plains, the human-faced spider. Our boy was paralyzed, not knowing how to react. His eyes filled with surprise. He could not believe that Yoa was one of the 10 great venomous creatures of the Central Plains. With an embarrassed look, Huan began to touch her fingers and swore that she had never intended to deceive him. She had only thought it would be better to be sure first, because of the promise they had made in the past. Soryang began to observe her carefully, realizing that this was the reason why she had been hesitating. She began to approach Soryang knowing that a promise was a promise. Without hesitating for a second, she gave our boy a hug. Soryang couldn't help but blush like a tomato, but then someone coughed, making his eyes widen in surprise. It was Yun who was awake and, with an embarrassed expression, asked if she should give the two of them some space. Seeing that she was awake, our boy panicked, and upon seeing his expression, she got nervous and started to gaze off to one side. It was already daytime and the sun was shining high in the sky. And 2 days later, Soryang began saying goodbye to Xiao and the others. Xiao began waving goodbye to them and thanked them deeply, promising she would never forget that debt of gratitude. The incident came to an end, and they departed from the Namgung clan. Fortunately, after Yoa consumed Soryang's Yongkai, she transformed into the appearance of Lady Huan. He assumed they would no longer have to worry about those piercing gazes. With a kind smile, he asked her if she was okay, asking her to hold on a little longer and assuring her that he would let her out as soon as they arrived. Upon hearing this, Yoa couldn't help but feel happy. Yoa was inside a cage. Du Pi reached out his hand and asked Soryang if he had any idea about the next part of the journey. Soryang explained that originally, after recovering the ice jade, he had been planning to head directly to Mount Ganga, where the fat-tailed geckos lived. But now that they had brought Yoa along, he was debating whether they should stop by the Tang clan first, since he wasn't sure if Yoa could endure an even longer trip. Yoa began shaking her head no, and upon noticing this, Soryang became confused, not knowing if she was okay. Her eyes began to shine with worry. Soryang approached the cage and a tear formed in his eyes. He couldn't believe it. He wondered if she was really worried about him. Thinking that she was such a kind and gentle soul moved him deeply. He thanked Yoa and promised her that he would take them there as quickly as he could. With a confident look, Soryang turned around and decided to go directly to Mount Ganga as planned. They would take the fat-tailed geckos and Yoa and return together to the Tang clan. Du Pi nodded his head. They began sailing down the river. The sky was full of seagulls, and our boy was enjoying the views. Two people who were on the ship began to talk to each other. One of them asked the other if he had heard the news that, apparently, the leader of the alliance had personally led the Blue Dragon unit on an expedition this time. The other mentioned that he had heard that the guys captured during the recent raid on the Blood Cult base had revealed information about the locations of other fortresses. With a worried expression, the boy with a ponytail revealed that he had heard there were barely any casualties in that battle, which seemed quite incredible to him. It was said that someone had managed to create a poisonous mist that only affected members of the Blood Cult. Soryang was in shock since they were talking about him. With a curious gaze, the boy with the ponytail asked his friend who had accomplished such an incredible feat. The friend mentioned that since there was a possibility that the cult could retaliate, the alliance had decided not to reveal his identity. Whoever it was, he was nothing less than a hero, and he had decided to admire that person from that moment on. Soryong felt excited as he began to remember his past life where he was a YouTuber. While he was distracted by the avalanche of compliments, before they realized it, they had arrived at Mount Ganga. They got off the ship and reached the area where the waterfall was. With a sincere gaze, Soryong explained that he wasn't very good at light foot techniques, so he wouldn't be able to cross by himself. Therefore, he asked if Lady Huan and Commander Gupi could go and bring back the little ones. He knew there wasn't anyone there this time to throw him across to the other side. Gupi began to touch his head. He was not sure if the geckos would follow them without Soryong. With a sincere gaze, Huang admitted that Gupi was right. She told Soryong that it would probably be better if he went in person, or else she asked him if she should try to extend a wild kudzu vine to the other side. With a confused expression, one of the warriors began to point toward the sky and asked Soryong to look. Our boy became somewhat confused and turned around. Yoa was climbing the mountain. Soryong panicked and asked her to come down. At that moment, the spider decided to use its silk and made a beautiful jump, passing over Soryong. She landed in front of them. The eyes of Soryong and the others were full of surprise. Yoa began to stretch her arms, and Soryong's attention was fixed on her. He wondered if that was ballooning and if Yoa was telling him that she could also fly because she was a spider. Ballooning. Most people didn't know it, but spiders, despite not having wings, were insects that could fly. By giving their body to the wind, they could fly dozens or even hundreds of kilometers. This phenomenon was called ballooning. Sometimes, while walking down the street, if one suddenly felt like they had walked into a web suspended in the air, that was the trace left by ballooning. His eyes widened in amazement upon realizing that Yoa could also do ballooning. An idea came to his mind. Not long after, Yoa hugged Soryong, and with a jump and using ballooning, they reached the waterfall. Our boy was happy to see that this had worked. He couldn't help but hug Yoa since, according to him, she was incredible. He didn't know how she could be so ridiculously versatile. Yoa began to show a smile. With an annoyed look, Huang approached them and expressed her discomfort with the hug to Soryong. She explained that, since Yoa had her appearance, the situation made her feel as if it were herself who was being cradled, which felt strange to her. Soryong got nervous and stopped hugging Yoa. He asked them to wait a moment and decided to go bring the geckos. Our boy entered the cavern. Sunlight was coming in through the hole in the roof, and in front of Soryong were the geckos. He started to show a smile and caught their attention. The geckos turned around, and upon seeing Soryong they felt somewhat surprised. They jumped and Soryong started running toward them. He was worried and wanted to know if they had been okay and if they weren't hurt anywhere. The geckos started licking our boy's face, and he couldn't help but smile. He realized they had become even more affectionate during his absence, and was very happy to see them looking healthy. He began to show the ice jade, and promised to take good care of them if they came with him. The geckos began to watch it closely. They started to show a smile. Soryong decided to name them. He called the female Snow and the male Ice. Carrying the geckos in his arms, Soryong decided it was time to go to their new home. And so, Snow and Ice became part of the family.